Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss The Flash, starring Ezra Miller, Sasha Calle, Ben Affleck, Michael Shannon, Ron Livingston, and Shroud, forgive me if I said that wrong, Jeremy Irons, and Michael Keaton, directed by Andy Muschietti. Now, I went to this movie twice, and not that I was looking forward to it or anything like that. The most part I was looking forward to was Michael Keaton returning as Batman. But the first time I saw it was in an IMAX early advanced fan screening, and people were cheering during then. And the second time I went was in a regular theater, and not a lot of cheering. It was just, oh, okay, that kind of thing. And I'm one of those, well, let's get into the movie, and you'll see what I'm going to be like. Let's get into it. Barry Allen, returned by Ezra Miller, gets his routine breakfast in the morning, and while the clerk is making his sandwich, Alfred Pennyworth, returned by Jeremy Irons, calls him and tells him to go to Gotham City, where Bruce Wayne, aka Batman, returned by Ben Affleck in a brief role, needs his help to help out at the hospital rescuing babies in the most unsafe manner, for example, putting one in a microwave without cooking it, which I don't want to picture that in my mind, is not a good idea to begin with, as he needs to eat something and then his stomach growls, which I didn't realize he needs food to go to action, and it never comes up again until the very end. After that, nothing else. And the CGI on the babies looked really bad, as well as this opening sequence. Bruce goes after some young robbers of the Falcone gang, I'll say, that are making a mess that ends up on a bridge where Diana Prince, aka Wonder Woman, returned briefly, very briefly, by Gal Gadot, enters to save the day, and Barry helps out as well as, and the green screen on the chase of these criminals looks so bad. And all this happened while the clerk was making his food, and I'm thinking this movie is going to be kind of a drag, but I hope it's entertaining, and this humor is not my favorite. Kind of my problem with Shazam, which is DC can't make humor, in my opinion. Or, well, they can't make humor funny, I should say. Barry runs into his old school friend Iris West, played by Kirsten Clemens, while Barry is at work, and she asks about her father's trial. And while his father Henry, played by this time Ron Livingston, not Billy Crudup, calls from prison, and he seems kind of like a downer in this movie. While Barry runs to the house he grew up in, and we flash back with Barry as a youth, and he was wearing a Scooby Doo shirt while he's with his mother Nora, and he looks back to what he should have done instead of what really happened, which is Nora accidentally getting stabbed by Henry getting home, and instead of calling 911, Barry decided to run away like he will when he leaves the house, and the prison hangs up the phone. And Barry sees the timeline where his mother lives and tells Bruce about it, and this whole time travel thing in this movie is hard enough as it goes. And it gave me a headache in both viewings. And Barry tells Bruce about it, and the effects were not great, but it was good, but not the best. But it's not as great as other superhero movies, in my opinion. Meanwhile, Iris meets Barry to talk with him and lets her in his place and grabs a beer for him. And Iris, while he does a trick that was kind of cool, so I was going with it at this point. Barry decides to go back in time behind Bruce's back and gets the tomatoes for his mother at the grocery store and puts it in her cart and goes even further after the day to the point something that I swear to God I thought was Darkseid, because it looked like Darkseid punching Barry into a different timeline and steals an elderly couple's clothing, which is disrespectful as he goes inside the house and eats like a pig until he sees a longer-haired Barry that I'm going to call Barry number 2 for the rest of the movie. These characters are stiff. Even the two Barrys themselves, as Barry number 1 was very by the rules, as the Justice League might have changed him quite a bit. The two Barrys go to the school where they study, and when Barry number 1 picks up Barry number 2, as well as any of the humor, is not funny, as DC is trying way too damn hard to be funny like Shazam, which it's not. Barry number 1 loses a tooth and doesn't have the power anymore, or the powers, I'll say, while Barry number 2 gets the powers, and unfortunately, I'm not laughing one bit, as this is not any better than the first Shazam, in my opinion. The second one, not so much, but in my opinion, but take it from someone who gave the first Shazam around like a 5. This is the kind of film that was some bad humor, but stop with the humor as it's making me not laugh. For example, Barry number 2 playing around with his powers to the point he abuses it and gets his clothes burned, and we see him nude. And I thought, oh my god, just stop with the humor, because unfortunately it's not funny. Barry number 1 lets Barry number 2 borrow the ring where his suit is, and he puts it on, and he says it hurts in the privates, which was unnecessary for so many reasons. We see General Zod returned by Michael Shannon when in the events of Man of Steel were happening, and this movie is frustrating me with the timeline and all the switcheroos, and as it turns out, I'm having an okay time, but not the greatest of times. Barry number 1 looks up the Justice League and calls Thomas Curry, returned briefly by Tamara Morrison, as he realizes the timeline is destroyed, and they keep bringing up Eric Stoltz as Marty McFly. And Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse does a better job at the time traveling thing than this movie does, in my opinion. The two Barrys go to Bruce Wayne's house, and Bruce in this timeline is returned by Michael Keaton, hasn't been Batman in many years, and the slapstick in this scene is terribly off, in my opinion. Barry number 1 tells Bruce about how he went through time and changed the future, which Bruce said earlier in the film he could also destroy everything. And I wish Barry didn't get this frustrating plot. I was having a headache both viewings of this movie. And Barry asks Bruce to help them, but he declines. And I like Michael Keaton back as Batman. The two Barrys enter the Batcave, which is cool in my opinion. Like I said, Michael Keaton's return as Batman is the best thing about the movie. And I'll get to the second best thing later on, and the dialogue is cringeworthy at times, except for Batman saying the line, "Yeah, I'm Batman." Barry knows how Bruce is watching the two Barrys and talks with him about fate and parents, and he decides to dress up as Batman one last time, as he will help them find a superhuman being. And the Barrys, along with Batman, go to Russia together, and the Bat plane is pretty cool to see again in this movie. As they go to Russia, the Barry number 2, as well as Batman, find their way up, as Barry number 1 hangs on to Batman and gets in a tunnel and fights off the Russians and get to the superhuman being, as Batman uses a flip plane to get to the combination in the superhuman being's cage. And they find not Superman, but Supergirl, aka Kara, played by Sasha Calle. And this is the second best thing about the movie, in my opinion. She's a badass in this movie. As they escape, Batman has an escape plan to free Kara, and the two Barrys, as well as Batman himself, as they get to the top of the... Batman says, "We try not to die," until Supergirl attacks the Russians with Batman's Hell, and Hell suddenly faints. And all of this is making me not laugh but it's making me kind of laugh in a random kind of way, as it's not meant to be funny, but when it tries to be, it doesn't work. Kara tries to fly away and puts her uniform on, and she goes on to find General Zod. And this Kara story is fine, but she has a better arc than, say, Helen Slater, in my opinion. Barry number 1 tells Bruce about how his family dies, while Barry number 2 overhears the conversation while Barry number 1 is trying to get his powers back, as Bruce helps Barry number 1 getting his powers back and is a failure mission. Meanwhile, Supergirl sees General Zod as well as Faora Ol, also from Man of Steel, returned by Anti-Trow, forgive me if I said that wrong, killing a commanding officer in Earth for not bringing the missing Kryptonian, and helps Barry number 1 getting his powers back, and decides then to help out as the Barrys as well as Batman to defeat General Zod, which is realistic for comic book reasons. But I guess go along with it at this point in order to get Barry number 1's power back. Barry number 1 has his powers back, and they prepare for the final fight, and Bruce says, like he said in the first film from 1989, "You want to get nuts? Let's get nuts." Which was a badass moment in the movie in particular. General Zod is confronted by Supergirl as she asks what did he do to her cousin Kal-El, and Supergirl beats up on Zod until eventually she gets stabbed by Zod, and he will unfortunately escape with her blood while the berries fight off the other Kryptonians, and Batman is just flying around and makes spaceships crash into each other and blows up a spaceship as his Batplane gets shot down and smashes himself into a spaceship, and Barry number 2 tries to change back in time, and Barry number 1 goes after him and tells him it's a bad idea, and they go back to Batman's fight the space giant, as he is almost dead after defeating it, and Barry number 2 and Supergirl fight Zod until he finds out their movements and stabs Supergirl once again, and Barry number 2 gets a knife arm as he keeps going back until they find a way to win. And this is getting to the point that I'm very frustrated, as Barry number 2 doesn't get the point, and I'm tired of this movie as I'm exhausted. Barry number 1 tells Barry number 2 to let go of the past, and we get the dark side looking monster, as it turns out to be Barry number 3, as it's Barry as an adult grown up from Barry number 2, and the timelines blows up, and we see Christopher Reeve as Superman, as well as Helen Slater as Supergirl, and Nicolas Cage as Superman from that failure project that Tim Burton wanted to for the longest time. In the original Flash, as I can't remember the actor's name, and Barry number 1 tells the two Barrys to stop changing the timeline, and Barry number 2 saves Barry number 1 from Barry number 3's blade, and Barry number 2 dies, which looks so unrealistic. And Barry number 1 goes back to the grocery store and makes the tomatoes disappear from her cart, which he cries in front of his mother as she doesn't know who he is as he hugs her, which is a sad scene, sure, and I'll give the movie that. That was a tear-jerking scene, as he's never going to see his mother again, which kind of made me tear up, I guess. Barry comes back to his world while he fixed the camera in the store and goes to the courthouse and sees Henry as an innocent man, thanks to Bruce Wayne, who makes an appearance by George Clooney, while Barry asks Iris to go out on a date with each other. And the George Clooney cameo did get a cheer, but a bit of laughter, and his tooth falls out. And credits roll to an after-credits scene with Barry and Arthur Curry, a.k.a. Aquaman, played by the man whore himself, Jason Momoa, drunk. I didn't get this scene, as that was the most worthless after-credits scene ever, and this climax didn't thrill me as much either. Now it's time for my rating. I'll give this movie a 5.1 out of 10. The best character, in my opinion, is Michael Keaton returning as Batman, and Supergirl was pretty cool as well, but the characters are a little bit stiff. Even the Flash himself, or the 2 or 3 of them, and the effects were bad looking at times. And this whole thing, time travel thing, was very frustrating, as it's hard enough as it is. The choreography looked kind of staged, as it was fine, but not great to watch, as DC needs to stop with the humor. Just stop, okay? It's not funny. As I had this problem with the first Shazam, as this didn't make me laugh whatsoever. Except for maybe one scene, but that's about it. I didn't have the greatest time watching the movie, although I said I did. But at the end of it, I didn't. And 2 viewings, as Spider-Verse can do a time travel movie better than this movie can at the end of the day. It was alright. So I give it a so-so recommendation, as this isn't as good as I heard, so maybe a little too overrated in my opinion. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me for going back to the Justice League. And until we get to Blue Beetle and the new Aquaman movie, justice has been served.